Former CIA Director John Brennan, along with other national security intelligence officials, have been doing the rounds on cable news, um, promoting a domestic anti-terrorism bill as a response to obviously the recent storming of the Capitol by a mob of angry MAGA folks. That was the failed insurrection, which obviously left the country reeling and has really brought attention, renewed attention, and focus on the problem of white nationalist domestic terrorism in this country, which accounts for the overwhelming majority of domestic terrorism. In fact, over 95% or something like that in the year 2020 alone of terrorism attacks is from right-wing extremists, particularly, especially white nationalists in particular, but right-wing extremists broadly. And so they're calling on, similar to the way that they did following the last major terror attack on American soil, obviously the 9/11 terror attacks, which led to the Patriot Act, which had all sorts of unintended consequences in the way that it expanded the national intelligence surveillance apparatus, which already, prior to that, was incredibly robust and had too much power and really didn't need to be expanded, but actually expanded dangerously. So, given that precedent, there's sort of renewed calls for a domestic terrorism bill like that Patriot Act, which was geared towards obviously international terrorism, cracking down on foreign-funded terrorist organizations. And I think this is something that we need to be really wary of, given how harmful to our civil liberties the last that Patriot Act was. There were all sorts of really controversial, borderline unconstitutional, in fact, in some cases, outright unconstitutional provisions. Um, so the most famous of which was there was the national security letters provision, which basically enabled the FBI to get around having to go through the normal channels for warrants in order to surveil citizens or residents. Um, that basically made it so that they could go ahead and demand communication records from telecom companies relating to those suspected of involvement in terrorism without having to go through the court. And this was sort of the basis for the NSA's famous PRISM uh, scheme, which was, we later found out, I believe starting in 2012, the NSA collaborated with the FBI or with the CIA or both to basically collect in bulk the records of basically every single customer of big telecom companies like Verizon, regardless of whether or not they were suspected uh, in any terrorist plots. But that was the most famous one that was, of course, blown up by Edward Snowden, who's since left the country and sought asylum in Russia ever since. But a whistleblower who's being sought for treason for blowing the whistle on that scheme, totally unconstitutional, totally illegal. Again, this is without going. This is basically warrantless surveillance. But regardless of whether you were suspected of any crime or of any plot to do crime, to do terrorism. There was also the roving wiretap provision, which allows the government to tap every device a person uses, from cell, landline, and computer. That was with the permission from the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And then there was, of course, the lone wolf provision, which allows the government to surveil someone who may be involved in international terrorism, regardless whether they're actually connected to any organization or acting on their own behalf, thus why it's called the lone wolf provision. There was this other provision, which was the sneak and peek provision of the Patriot Act, which allowed law enforcement to conduct searches while delaying informing the suspect. So this is another thing that was basically really controversial, really insidious, and to the extent that it was used, really abusive of our civil liberties. The sneak and peek provision was overwhelmingly used for drug investigation cases, some theft, some fraud cases, some immigration stuff, but overwhelmingly for drug investigations, and hardly ever for cases of suspected terrorism. In fact, of 11,000 requests for delayed notification search warrants between 2011, 2012, and 2010, only 51 were used for terrorism cases. So again, delayed, these are searches that allowed delay in informing the suspect, hardly ever used for terrorism cases, which is what the entire Patriot Act, the central thrust of the bill, its purpose for existing was about, and it in fact was only used basically always for drug investigations, which is obviously an abuse of power, an abuse of our civil liberties. Just turns everybody into sort of targets. You know what I mean? Now, Joe Biden in particular seems to me to lack credibility when it comes to, you can't really trust him. For example, on the with the Patriot Act, Biden lamented that it didn't go far enough. First of all, he sort of boasted that it was basically written by him, or that it was basically based on a previous bill, which I'll talk about in a moment, which was introduced in the Senate by him on behalf of the Clinton Justice Department following the Oklahoma City bombings. I'll come back to that. But regarding the Patriot Act, Biden had a problem with the removal of provisions. One that would have allowed police to carry out 48-hour emergency surveillance without a court order, and another that would have allowed the police to use accidentally illegally obtained wiretap evidence. So Biden had a problem with those really sketchy provisions being removed. As I said, Biden introduced, this was on behalf of the Clinton administration, in the mid-90s, in the Senate, the Omnibus Counterterrorism Bill. That was in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Oklahoma City building bombing. That was that was a bill which infringed on the First Amendment right of association by criminalizing contributing to government-designated terrorist groups, even if the donation was for totally unrelated activity. So, for example, at that time, the U.S. government designated the ANC Party of Africa, which was, of course, the prevailing political party democratically elected in South Africa ever since Mandela was released from prison pretty much in the early 90s, was once deemed by the U.S. government a terrorist threat, even though funding for that for that party helped support, its positive anti-apartheid geared political activity. There was also this really weird provision which shields the government from having to disclose source of its evidence used to prosecute someone if that evidence was deemed as classified, which is basically a total violation of the constitutional principle that an individual always has a right to know the evidence against him so that he can challenge him, otherwise known as the right to confront one's accuser. So that was the previous iteration of the Patriot Act, I guess, in response to that Oklahoma City building bombing by Timothy McVeigh. After that, Biden was a big proponent of Bob Dole's Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which has been called by legal scholars, one of the worst bills ever passed by Congress, to the extent that it undermined the Great Writ, which is habeas corpus, which is recognized as the Great Writ for its great power to to basically free people who have been wrongfully imprisoned, on a wrongful charge, and was basically extended by the Supreme Court in the '60s to empower wrongly imprisoned uh, prisoners at any stage of the criminal process, whether at sentencing, at trial, at detention, to be released if it was found that they were wrongly imprisoned. So this is something that has overwhelmingly, uh, for a 22-year period, from the '70s to 1995, found basically what is it, a landmark study of virtually every state and federal death. So with regards to the indispensable protection that it provided to death row inmates, uh, there was a study. There was a landmark study from, I think, Columbia Law School, which found. Hold on, let me look this up here. I'm quoting an article from the New Yorker here. Columbia Law School study of virtually every state and federal death penalty appeal from 1973 to 1995 reported that courts found serious reversible error in nearly 7 of every 10 of the thousands of capital sentences that were fully reviewed during the period. There were so many mistakes, the study found, that after state courts threw out 47% of death sentences due to serious flaws, a later federal review found serious error, which is error undermining the reliability of the outcome in 40% of the remaining sentences. And it goes on to say that in 73% of those cases, uh, it was found that the sentencing was too harsh for the death row inmates, that they deserved lighter sentencing. And then in 9% of the cases, those defendants were found totally innocent. So basically, an indispensable constitutional protection, which basically the bill by Bob Dole, which Biden supported, greatly undermined. I should mention that also the Patriot Act, eventually there was a provision that was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, but there was a provision in the Patriot Act which actually struck down habeas corpus by allowing for indefinite detention of immigrants who aren't charged with crimes. So that was eventually, thank God, struck down by the Supreme Court. But coming back to the Bob Dole bill, that was in 1996. Totally undermined habeas corpus. And also wanted to talk about Biden's track record with regards to just sort of blindly empowering and enabling the federal government to crack down on regional law enforcement, on state and local law enforcement, with all these. There was the cops crime bill, which he supported, which was designed to. This was under Clinton, to promote and supplement community policing practices, but had zero accountability because Congress couldn't monitor to make sure that the funding for the bill was being used properly. And combined with the militarization of police from other federal programs, which equipped them with basically federal weaponry, provided surplus military equipment to local policing, which obviously undermines the notion of community policing practices, and basically totally failed while being really expensive. I think it reduced crime by about 1%, but cost something like $8 billion. So bloated budget for totally wasteful and counterproductive law enforcement. And then Biden was also a big proponent of the Byrne Grant, which was something for anti-drug and anti-gang task forces, which were designed to basically, again, supplement local policing, but also had accountability problems to the extent that it was multi-jurisdictional. So beyond the oversight of, say, a local sheriff or police chief, and succeeded at its intended goal of limiting the availability of illicit drugs, but made, again, combined with other concurrent practices that prioritize the militarization of police and paramilitary policing practices, basically led to a more aggressive and militaristic approach to policing that also had the dual problem of being funded on the basis of arrests, of raw arrest statistics. So basically prioritizing arrests, which of course sort of has the additional consequence of sort of inverting the way that drug investigations are traditionally handled, which is where you arrest mid-level dealers in an effort to get leads on the major dealers, and then basically now you're going after the bigger fish in order to try to get tips on the smaller fish, in order to get more arrests on the smaller fish, the low-level dealers on the street. So totally inverted that deal-making structure. So the reason why I give you that overview, that sort of broad overview, is because Joe Biden has historically not been very trustworthy, not very helpful. He's always been sort of a hawk when it comes to law enforcement in general, but particularly on surveillance. The Patriot Act, again, provisions that sort of allowed for blatant disregard of habeas corpus, in addition to really, really sketchy stuff where the FBI was basically given license for unwarranted, totally unwarranted, warrantless surveillance that basically never was useful in for its intended purpose of cracking down on terrorism. And I think there was another stat here that I wanted to throw out here. But what was it? I'm not going to find it. Anyway, yeah, so in addition to that, you should know that, the Capital City riot obviously really exposed the really jarring dissonance in the way that our law enforcement approaches white nationalists, right-wing extremist protesters, or if you want to call them rioters in the case of the Capitol storming, versus Black Lives Matter, colored protesters, Black and Muslim protesters. And it's really infuriating, not only for the reason that I mentioned, which is that overwhelmingly our sort of violence stems from these right-wing extremists and right-wing protesters. But basically, there are these also long-standing federal and local surveillance practices like police infiltration, which really disproportionately, again, target left-leaning groups in addition to protesters of color, the Black Lives Matter wing of protest movement. And that's something that Ryan Grimm recently did a really great piece about with John Schwartz in The Intercept called A Short History of U.S. Law Enforcement Infiltrating Protests. And this is something I actually just discovered. I really didn't know very much about this, but it sheds light about the history dating back to the 50s with the inception of an FBI program, counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO, which from 1956 to 1971 was basically just an operation to sort of harass and deter and crack down on left-wing protests. And it cites a number of examples, and I'm going to read, this stuff is really disturbing. And so an FBI informant, as an example, this is stuff that's still going on to this day. So again, you need to understand that what you saw at the Capitol, where you saw police that were in some cases obviously sympathetic to the cause, to the MAGA, the Blue Lives Matter and all that stuff. A lot of these activists felt really entitled to go in there. You can see videos of them sort of looting the Senate chamber as they're being asked politely by a police chief, "Hey guys, it's a really sacred place. Could I maybe get you guys to leave?" Just being like sort of really polite and non-combative. and them just sort of being like, hey man, like, shouldn't you be stopping us? Like, just really jarring stuff that you could never imagine if they had been black. So given that context, and everybody knows if those protesters had been black or Muslim or BLM or Antifa or etc., they wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the perimeter of the Capitol building. But this really sort of concretizes that dissonance in a very clear, visceral way. Reading about this sort of history of police infiltration, where the FBI basically, and this is something that happened a lot, I think, during the Black Lives Matter protests, there were stories of vandalism and looting of private property and destruction of private property that obviously led to a decline in the public opinion favorability of the Black Lives Matter protests. I think right now it's at like a net zero national favorability rating or something. Basically, it's lost support on the heels. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that a lot of that was instigated, if not directly started by some FBI informants working on the inside who were bad faith actors trying to basically incite violence in order to justify a crackdown. And this is something that actually dates back, like I said, to this program, Counsel Pro FBI surveillance program that lasted from 1956 until it was exposed in 1971. And the history, for example, I'm quoting this article from The Intercept, where an FBI informant who said he was also a member of the John Birch Society helped assemble time bombs and place them on an army track. That's one example. An FBI informant in the radical political organization Weather Underground took part in the bombing of a Cincinnati public school. A prominent member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War and FBI informant pushed for shooting and bombing, and his advocacy apparently did indeed lead to a bombing and a bomb threat. So you see what I'm saying? Like, in some cases, they're literally just engaging in outright violence. An FBI informant in Seattle drove a young black man named Larry Ward to a real estate office that engaged in housing discrimination and encouraged him to place a bomb there. The police were waiting and killed Ward. The FBI also allowed informants within right-wing organizations to participate in violence against progressive activists. So Gary Thomas Rowe, who infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in 1960, provided the FBI with 3 weeks' warning that the Klan was planning attacks on Freedom Riders arriving in Alabama from the north. The FBI stood by and allowed the attacks to occur. Local police gave the Klan 15 minutes to assault the activists. In those 15 minutes, the white supremacists, including Rowe, set the Freedom Rider bus on fire in an attempt to burn them alive. Rowe may also have played a role in the infamous 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which killed 4 young girls. He was in the car with 3 other Klansmen in 1965 when they chased down and murdered Viola Luzo. Like I said, eventually Counsel Pro was uncovered in 1971, but the practice apparently continues to this day. And apparently, police forces in the U.S. continued the same tactics. In 1978, an undercover officer encouraged 2 hapless young activists to seize control of a television tower in Puerto Rico. When they arrived, they were gunned down by 10 policemen. Tellingly, when Puerto Rican government asked the FBI to investigate what happened, the FBI gave the government a clean bill of health. Funny how that works. The FBI, after 9/11, got back in the business of encouraging violent acts in a big way, although they were generally much more careful to step in before the violence ever actually occurred. When Trevor Aronson, a contributor at The Intercept, examined U.S. prosecutions for international terrorism in the decade after the attacks, he found 5 examples. This was the stat I wanted to mention from earlier. I couldn't find. He found 5 examples of actual plots. Actual terrorist plots. By contrast, 150 people were indicted in sting operations that existed only thanks to the encouragement of the FBI and its informants. According to Aronson, the FBI is much better at creating terrorists than it is at catching terrorists. So again, this is after Counsel Pro was exposed and, in theory, outlawed. But the same tactics have existed, and this gets to the overreach of the U.S. surveillance state. Again, Patriot Act sort of serves as like sort of the symbol of that surveillance overreach by the W administration in the early 2000s following 9/11. Obviously, it was a time of great fear and heightened anxiety given the terror attack on our soil. And now we're right back in the same situation. Obviously, we just had the storming of the Capitol building, which was a similar national act of terrorism on our soil. This time it was domestic terrorism. Uh, so, so there's talk of a new bill which would basically designate domestic terrorism as an official federal charge in the way that Biden's omnibus counterterrorism uh, bill did for terrorism. It designated terrorism um, as a federal crime, in addition to, again, uh, giving it latitude to determine what a government designated terrorist group was, what constituted that, even if it was the ANC, the African National Congress, which is ridiculous. The Party of Mandela, can you imagine, was deemed a terrorist group, and you were deemed complicit and accessory if you donated to Mandela's campaign for anti-apartheid. Ridiculous. So so I'm not sure that we need to basically apply maximum pressure, guys, on Joe Biden to push back against these intelligence surveillance hawks, because this stuff severely curtails and undermines our civil liberties by turning regular, ordinary people into targets, it expands the definition of terrorism and domestic terrorism and sort of blurs the lines and gets used in illegal, unconstitutional ways to pursue all these sort of separate immigration or drug investigative or fraud or theft related crimes and issues that it's really not supposed to. It promotes sort of the kind of fear that turns Americans against each other, obviously, which there's no polling out that indicates that Americans are actually more afraid of each other than they are of foreign terrorist groups, um, um, etc. So basically, we need to be really wary of how much power we hand to these really unscrupulous, dangerous, deranged individuals, and make sure that Joe Biden feels the maximum pressure to push back, that he understands the American people really reject frankly the expansion of surveillance state of the Patriot Act, in addition to all these other like uh, really egregious tangentially related stuff that I just mentioned, and just not fall for it. Try to remain cool, try to remain calm, and be advised that this is not happening. We do have some progressive allies in Congress. Rashida Tlaib has been very vocal, AOC as well, in pushing back against any talk of expanding the American surveillance state, because Patriot Act wasn't necessary even. We really don't need this stuff. We already have, via the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, all the surveillance powers we need before the Patriot Act, much less after, and much less after this recent episode that we had with terrorism. So let's just keep that in mind, and let's not allow us to get abused and exploited this way and turned against each other for nothing.